Hello, and welcome to the virtual Scandinavia House with the director of The Blinding Sea, George Toombs. This film is now on view at our virtual cinema platform at scandinaviahouse.org, and I'm happy to say that we have been able to extend the screening of the run until November 5th. So if you haven't had a chance to see it yet, please do buy a ticket. It is available virtually. Other things happening at Scandinavia House in cinema, we will be hosting the Baltic Film Festival that starts on Thursday. We have separated the festival into 3 sections this year, so we will be presenting it in the first weekend, which is on Thursday, will be the comedies, Laugh and Cry, so we'll have 3 films in that section. And then October 29th through November 1st, we'll be screening Baltic thrillers with 3 films. And then from November 12th through November 15th, we'll be showing Baltic showcases or festival favorite films. The full schedule is on our website and as well as the balticfilmfestival.org website. Thank you, George, for joining us. George Toombs is an award-winning author and filmmaker. As a journalist, he was reported from 6 continents before serving as an executive director for a medical association and then as a university professor. He has a PhD in history and a philosophy and science from McGill University in Montreal, and Blinding Sea is his first film. Welcome, George.
Thanks for having me, Kyle. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. I always like to start at the beginning of the thing, beginning of the story or the beginning of the film. I'm curious, what drew you to the Roald Amundsen story and what made you want to tell this story? This is a little bit different than what you used to be working on. So I'm just sort of curious why now and this, so.
Well, it's a funny story because I came to Roald Amundsen very indirectly, even backwards, if you like, because as a journalist for many years, I would go to the Arctic region in northern Canada, to Nunavut and to northern Quebec, the Ngava Peninsula. And I did a lot of reporting in those years on forced relocations of Inuit communities to other locations and fundamental questions of justice for Inuit, who are, of course, an Aboriginal people and one of the founding peoples of Canada. And one time I was up there, I started hearing stories about Amundsen and his the way he had a completely different style as an explorer from other explorers, and how Inuit remembered him well and considered him to be, in a way, one of theirs. And then I got the chance to go on a research icebreaker wintering in the Beaufort Sea. It was ferociously cold. I live in Montreal and we have cold weather in the winter, but it's nothing like the Arctic, the high Arctic, with the wind. Of course, there's no trees to break the wind up there. It's ferocious. And the research icebreaker is called the Amundsen, and I was on that ship, locked in the ice for about 3 weeks. My son-in-law said to me, "Be sure you take a video camera with you, a high definition video camera." He actually took me by the hand, Adam did, and helped me buy the best equipment I could find. And I said, "What's the film about, Adam?" And he said, "I don't know, just start shooting, start filming." So I came to the whole subject backwards. And then I said to myself, but surely if this ship is named after Roald Amundsen and the Inuit on shore on the islands in the Arctic archipelago are telling me all these stories about Amundsen, there must be a really interesting story. And then I began putting things together one after the other. I returned to Nunavut to interview Inuit about their memories, their family, the oral traditions about Amundsen. And I came across a clan of Inuit who are all descended, their grandsons or great-grandsons or great-great-granddaughter or great-great-great-grandsons of a woman, Kulyuk, who actually proposed marriage to Amundsen. And Amundsen wrote this himself in his own diary. And he said no. Finally, he thought about it, but he said no. But something must have happened between them. And I found it so interesting that he got involved with people, he built up relationships, and of course he learned a tremendous amount of ancestral, if you like, or traditional Aboriginal knowledge, which he applied. Whereas other explorers tended to take from the Inuit, in the United States, they're still called Eskimos, uh, take that knowledge and make it their own and, claim to be some kind of a world-class genius because they'd invented all these things. Amundsen said, no, this is what I've learned from the Inuit. And he was, through his life, always very full of gratitude, and he was very open. He was a difficult person, I'm sure, a driven person, maybe sometimes very self-involved. But on that level, he was not a racist. He was not an exploitative person. And the relationship that he had with them became kind of the focus of the story.
Right, right. And so because of you approached it through sort of more of the Indigenous to First Nations point of view, you were able to tell that kind of story that has maybe been left out of the sort of the Amundsen canon more, or have you found that people weren't focusing on the Indigenous, what he learned from the Indigenous communities as an explorer, and is that why you sort of want to tell it this way?
Well, I'll tell you, the way to answer that, Kyle, is I spoke to a very well-known Norwegian scholar, and because I'm about what I'm about to repeat, I will not name him. Okay, I'm not going to mention his name, but I showed him an early draft of the film, and he said, "You have no right to say that the Inuit taught Amundsen anything. No, he learned from them, but they didn't teach him anything." But I was thinking, I mean, I was a university professor for several years. It's possible that my students learned from me without my doing anything. But my goodness, I really worked hard to teach them things. And I think that Amundsen was in what the great Scottish American nature writer John Muir called the University of the Wilderness. He was not reading a book in the Royal Geographic Society in London and like saying, oh, this is what all English explorers say. He went directly to the wilderness, and he went directly to one of the main polar peoples to learn firsthand. And in his intimate diary that he wrote, there's no two ways about it, he names each person who taught him skills, and they would laughingly teach him over and over again, maybe 50 or 60 times, how to build an igloo, or how to drive a dog team, or the basis of Inuit nutrition. And nutrition is a very important part of the story.
Right. And where, after visiting the far Arctic and talking with the community up there, where else did you do your research, and what other types of research did you do to tell the story?
Well, I have a PhD in history and philosophy of science. So the question of what does it mean to really know something is, it's like one of the big questions I keep asking myself. So I did a lot of exhaustive research in archives and in libraries, including the Scotland Polar Research Institute in Cambridge, England, and in other places. I did the typical kind of academic research as well. But making a film is not like writing an article or writing a book. First of all, it's the camera which becomes the eye, and you are following the camera eye, and you are learning how to see things in a completely different way. And then when you do that, and when your film is about interactions between people, then the relationships that you develop with people become extremely important. You have to gain the trust of people. You would like to have mutual trust in both directions. It was really a learning experience for me in that sense. As well, the way I, as a Southern Canadian living in Southern Quebec, in Eastern Canada, the way I see the world, the light in the sky that I'm used to, the kind of color that the Northern Lights have in Southern Quebec, that's something quite different from learning how to see things in Nunavut, which is the Inuit world. And I can't say that I learned to see, because when I would go hunting with people, they would see all kinds of wildlife and I just saw white. So, but I mean, I made the effort to learn how to see the way they did. So there were different kinds of research. I was extremely lucky in one case because I was just saying, you know, there was that Maud expedition that Amundsen went on, and it was from Norway, from Tromsø, over the North Cape, and then up along the northern coast of Siberia to Alaska. The idea of the Maud expedition was that he would eventually get up into the polar drift of the ice sheet going towards the North Pole, and that he might even make it to the North Pole. But he was quite impatient. It was not that easy to do. You can't dictate the way tides move and winds and currents, and the conditions were not that favorable. But he met a young girl whose mother had just died, and her name was Kakunita. She was a Chukchi, Siberian Chukchi, who are also an Aboriginal or indigenous people in Siberia. And he ended up legally adopting her. This I found out, which was very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And I kept looking on the internet, like, can I find anyone who's related to her? It'd be so interesting because I got the idea, okay, I've interviewed so many people and I've gone time and again. I went many, many times to Nunavut for the film to get to know the Kuliuk clan, the clan of this woman. I got to know members of the Amundsen family, great niece and great nephew, who are marvelous people. And I went to see them over and over again, and we've become, really good friends. I interviewed the grandson of Robert Falcon Scott, the granddaughter of Ernest Shackleton, the grandson of Teddy Evans, one of Scott's officers on the South Pole expedition. Then I said to myself, oh, is there some way to find Kakunita? Bing, I just suddenly, out of the blue, discovered that her daughter, that is, since Amundsen adopted Kakunita, this was the granddaughter by adoption, if you like, lived in Mexico. And then I managed to contact her through a local newspaper in Mexico. And then I went to visit her and I interviewed her there. And then I said, what would be even more interesting, because the film is really about reconciliation of different worlds, different systems of knowledge. Wouldn't it be interesting to introduce this woman, Gloria Corbould, the daughter of Kakunita, who was adopted by Amundsen? Wouldn't it be interesting to introduce her to a member of the Amundsen family from Norway? So I invited them both at my expense. Ann-Christine Amundsen Jakobsen, the great niece of Roald Amundsen, to meet Gloria, her second cousin. And I rented a cottage for the weekend in southern Quebec, and we all got together, and I filmed that as a scene for the film. So I had many different types of research, and I had to keep thinking fast.
Yeah, and what I liked about this film is you tried to tell a story that hasn't been always told over and over and over, because everyone knows the Amundsen story, what we read in our basic history books. So it was very nice to see a different side of him. And was the daughter or the granddaughter apprehensive at all, or was she willing to, be a part of the film right away, or did you have to convince her at all?
I think she was bowled over. She was amazed that I tracked her down, that I found her. And she said, yeah, we've had these family stories forever, and no one's ever asked me. And where did you come from? How did you just pop up here one day? And then when she came to Montreal, which is where I live, I think it was one of the more interesting experiences of her life. Kakunita, after being adopted by Amundsen, went to live in Norway for several years. Roald Amundsen was not a father figure. Someone said to me, you criticize everyone else, but you never criticize Roald Amundsen. Why is that? Well, I'm a father, I'm a committed father, and I found that by adopting this girl and also legally adopting Camilla Carpendale, he was very negligent. He didn't take care of them, but he was always off raising more money for more polar expeditions and doing great things. He ended up declaring bankruptcy and then sending them back to Siberia, which was, I calculated that over the 4-year period that they were nominally living with Roald Amundsen, they were probably in the same town as him for about 3 months of that. So he was not a hands-on dad by any means. but um, Kakunita and the Carpendales had to flee Siberia when the Russian Revolution caught up with that part
Okay.
of the world.
Okay.
Camilla Carpendale's father was actually an Australian
Right.
who had married a Chukchi woman in Siberia, and he was the manager of a local Hudson's Bay Company fur post, fur trading post. And I think for the Soviet government, the Hudson's Bay Company, with its very British-looking flag, you know, the red ensign with the HBC letters on it, it was some kind of outgrowth of British imperialism, and they better get the heck out of there. So the family crossed the Bering Strait to Alaska in a whaleboat, which is like an umiak, a woman's whaleboat made of walrus skin, I think. And they ended up trying to get into the lower 48 of the United States as refugees, and they were refused. So they became Canadian citizens and ended up living in British Columbia.
Yeah,
So it's a very
there you
interesting
go.
story.
Guess the U.S. was closing borders even back then too. Um, what was the most difficult aspect of shooting this film? And I also am also very curious, since you faced some very adverse weather and climate conditions, what was the most extreme uh, weather conditions or waves or whatever that you faced?
I thought I'd seen rough weather,
Mm,
and I love going cross country skiing, and it was nothing like what was waiting for me up in Nunavut. And uh, to be the coldest day that I filmed, the wind chill was minus 63 Celsius or minus 90 Fahrenheit.
ugh,
And I was filming a wonderful scene with George Konana, who's a member of the Inuit community in Johaven, as he was showing his dog team to me, going back and forth on the ice. But I said to myself before shooting that time, I better take a high definition camera with digital cassettes in it in case the camera freezes. You never know. Because I thought if the camera freezes and I don't have some like physical support, um, it'll just pop and the whole thing will be gone.
right.
And actually the camera died,
Mm,
and I managed to pry it open and get the digital cassette out. And for me, it's one of the most beautiful scenes.
mm,
I should say though, it's going to make you laugh. Huskies
mm,
um, are like thoroughbreds.
mm,
They're the most amazing animals that you could possibly imagine, full of drive and energy and willpower and intelligence. And they're lots of fun to play with also, especially when they're puppies. But I had a little bit of dog phobia before I started making this film. And I was thinking like, oh my God, those dogs, they're going to be all over me. They're going to jump on me. They're going to, they're going to try to, they're going to bite me. I mean, who knows what could happen. And actually, the film helps me sort of um, get a handle on on a phobia. And I learned just to admire huskies, which are absolutely amazing creatures. And I mean, they, according to a Canadian explorer, Captain Bernier, huskies are the horses of the Arctic.
mm,
And by that he meant at a time when horses were still used for agriculture in southern Canada, he meant don't use horses in the polar environment. That was a tough day. I'm very fortunate that I don't get seasick. So
right.
I also filmed 3 weeks worth of scenes, which are in the film, on a tall ship going from southern Argentina, Tierra del Fuego, to the Antarctic Peninsula. And that stretch of sea on the Southern Ocean is notorious. It's probably one of the um, roughest seas in the world. And I'm lucky I don't get seasick, although I do admit that I felt disoriented, and it was sometimes, there was so much going on and the waves were so big all around the ship that I sometimes forgot things like, oh, keep cleaning the lens because you've got condensation on it
Oh,
or salt drops or things like that. Being on an icebreaker on the Amundsen research icebreaker was also very challenging. But then we were facing the effects of wind, tides, polar bears roaming around the ship. It was fascinating, but I wasn't always sure what was coming next. So that was also quite challenging.
Yeah. I had a good question to follow up that. Since you have been to sort of both upper poles, both the northern or North Pole and close to Antarctica, I was wondering if you could start to see the effects of climate change, or if you are able, since you have been going back more and more to Nunavut, that you're able to see. Are you seeing more change or climate changes?
I think probably the changes are most noticeable on the Antarctic Peninsula, which is possibly the part of the world that is heating up the fastest in terms of production of glaciers from the production of icebergs, from the calving of icebergs from glaciers and so forth. It's quite dramatic. I only went there once, so I have nothing to compare it with.
Right.
People I met there said to me, it's definitely getting warmer. It felt like a maritime climate and not too cold. In northern Canada, people say the permafrost is starting to melt, which could lead to the release of carbon into the environment, that different types of plants are pushing ever further northwards, that whole herds of caribou are going into decline because of climate change. These are things that people have told me, but I haven't been able to observe them myself. I asked this question to Inuit, and they have a different kind of attitude, and they said, you're putting this into a film, of course. I said, yes, I would be interested to interview you about that, because I thought I would have a climate change aspect in the film at that time. And they ended up telling me beautiful folk tales about a legendary hero, Kivyuk, and he's a great hero, sort of like Ulysses for the people in Europe. And I ended up not using that in the film because I just didn't have room for it. But people have different ways of responding to this kind of question. I don't really come with a lot of new understanding of climate change as a result of doing the film.
And my next question is about the Scott. Amundsen did not tell anyone he was going down to discover the South Pole. And he sort of beat Scott to it. Or he didn't sort of, he did beat Scott to the South Pole. And I was just wondering, when you were interviewing this family, how did they react to you, or how did they react to you making the film?
To which family are you referring?
The Scott family.
Ah, yes. Well, first of all, when you're interviewing people, it's sort of like gathering oral traditions, and this is what they believe or how they feel. And people sometimes say things very much to make a point and to take a stand. And so Falcon Scott, in the interview, he told me a lot of things, but I mean, he knew the film was about Amundsen, so he wanted to defend the reputation of his grandfather. However, regarding Amundsen, I think he was pretty dismissive. And the surprising thing is that he said that Amundsen had no interest in science at all. But then let's ask ourselves, what is science? Is science Victorian science written in a book in a great library in the halls of Cambridge University or the Royal Geographic Society? Or can science possibly include the understanding of traditional knowledge? And I don't mean just Aboriginal traditional knowledge, but there's a great deal of Scandinavian traditional knowledge. And I found it extremely interesting to track down, for example, the understanding in Norway, in Sweden, of scurvy going back at least 1,000 years, and different remedies. We could call them folk remedies, but I mean, they were remedies nonetheless. For example, eating cloudberries
Mm.
and multa or multabar. Um, it's a big thing in Scandinavia, and we have a lot of cloudberries in Canada as well. But so if Falcon Scott, the grandson, was very dismissive of Amundsen because he wasn't in it for the knowledge, and that's a direct quote. There was even a point in the interview where he said, well, it was easy for Amundsen because he just sat on the dog sled. I was just thinking, well, I'm not going to put that in the film, but no, that's not true, because Amundsen was a tremendous skier, and he hired polar experts and delegated authority over their domain to them. And some of the people around Scott had no prior polar experience, didn't know how to ski, didn't know anything about dogs. And it's very unfortunate what happened to a number of them towards the end.
You're talking about scurvy. How do the Inuits, how do they get their, what is their source of vitamin C, since plants don't really grow that far north?
Well, I think we should remember that vitamin C was isolated in the 1930s only.
Okay.
And Roald Amundsen was up in Nunavut in northern Canada from 1903 to 1905 or so. Then he went to the Yukon, and then he went to Alaska. But you didn't have to know that vitamin C had been scientifically isolated in the laboratory to know that there are remedies.
Mm.
And it's possible that the Inuit didn't know what scurvy was because they didn't experience it, because they were already eating in a very healthy fashion.
Mm.
Of course, they're sometimes subject to starvation in the olden times when, for example, caribou changed migration patterns or there was a sudden crash of the herd. But they would eat blubber of narwhals or beluga whales.
Mm.
I myself show my hand reaching for a piece of muktuk, which is narwhal blubber, during the film. And I mean, I don't show myself eating it because I didn't know how to do a selfie with a big high definition camera. I found it very interesting to eat narwhal. It was very interesting.
How did it
But
taste?
narwhal blubber and skin, it contains a lot of vitamin C.
Okay.
And so other animals than humans are able to synthesize vitamin C. Inuit could also eat their dogs if they needed to. Dog meat contains vitamin C, which is a big part of Amundsen's success. He was eating dog meat on the way to the South Pole, the way back, and all of his crew ate well. They gained weight, and they didn't suffer that much. Also, in the olden times, the Inuit, and in fact the Chukchi in Siberia, when they would go seal hunting through the ice in the winter, once they brought the seal up to the surface, they would open up the seal and then eat half-digested algae or plant matter from the intestines, because they could picture in their minds the seal in the gardens of the ocean underneath the ice, eating all kinds of plant matter, seaweed and so forth. And so this was one of their main sources of plant matter during the winter, and the winters are very long. And of course, in the summer, they would eat many different types of plants, like purple saxifrage, a beautiful plant, or blueberries or cranberries or cloudberries. They had different access to different types of berries. So by hunting birds and whales and seals and the odd caribou, they would get vitamin C that way, but also through the intestines of seals during the winter. And then during the summer, the short summer months, they would have access to fruit and flowers. But I mean, the Arctic is a desert. The Canadian Arctic is a desert. So they had to work extremely hard to find all these sources of food.
Okay, this is a question from one of our audience members, Mira. The Arctic has been used as a backdrop in numerous books and films for over a century and a half, and the people of the Arctic in a variety of countries have been exploited by the white man. In your film, you talk about the myth making and myth breaking with an emphasis on being aware of stereotypical presentations of the Arctic. How is this film different than the films before it?
Very interesting question, Mira. Thanks for looking at the movie. Well, I find, first of all, with myth making and myth breaking, that when you approach a figure who is so well known as Roald Amundsen, you have to be very cautious. You have to be very careful to present him as a human being with good, bad, and the other sides, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I mean, the problem with a national culture which defends a national hero, this is as true of Norway as it is of Great Britain, and I suppose of some of our hockey players in Canada, is that in a national culture with a national hero, he's either going to be portrayed, or she is either going to be portrayed as a total hero across the board, or the exact opposite of a hero, which is, someone contemptible or not at all as good as we thought. And I wanted to portray every character in the film as honestly as I could. The aspect of exploitation is also very important. Amundsen is someone who probably would have liked to live with the Inuit. As Mira may recall, towards the end of the film, I mentioned that he thought when his exploring was done, he would love to go back and live with them and live out his remaining years with them. Unfortunately, he was torn this way and that, and he wasn't always the master of his fate. He wasn't able to do everything that he wished to do. I think honestly, he would love to have raised those girls that he adopted as well, the Chukchi girls. He was not able to do it, whether because of his own psychological nature or otherwise. The thing about exploitation is, if we go look back in the era of Amundsen, the kind of exploitation that Inuit could be subject to during the Chicago World's Fair in the 1890s, entrepreneurs, basically pirates, went up on the Labrador coast and kidnapped Inuit in order to take them to exhibit them in Chicago. And then those Inuit caught diseases, and when they returned to Labrador, unfortunately, it led to epidemics and many people died. Inuit could also be subject to exploitation in another way. The land that they occupied, the land and the sea they occupied, became a kind of point of contention between different imperial powers. The British Empire laid its hands on the region. The Inuit, in many ways, today are showing how resilient they are, but in those years they were marginalized. They were considered to be auxiliaries in the great enterprise of white people. Then again, whaling wiped out whale populations. And Inuit were not doing industrial scale whale hunting. They weren't. They were doing a bit of subsistence hunting as a community event for large whales, and as on the individual level for smaller whales like belugas or narwhals. The resources of the land were taken out of their control, and they were kind of pushed into the role of auxiliaries. After Amundsen's time, other things happened through the actions of the Canadian government. They were as bad, if not worse. But I find Amundsen, if you look at Amundsen's interactions with people living in the Arctic Canada, he did not have like a secret family with children that we know of, with a young girl and a new girl. I mean, Robert Peary had two parallel families. Robert Flaherty, who made Nanook of the North, had a parallel family. He had a family up in, now it's in Grise Fjord in Ellesmere Island for different reasons. They were moved there from northern Quebec. Amundsen did not misappropriate knowledge that had been developed for thousands of years by Inuit and take authorship. He, on the contrary, said, this is what they showed me. Personally, I feel the less contact they have with so-called civilization, the better it will be for them. And I put that in the film as much as I could. And so he had the idea of sharing knowledge, and he certainly shared knowledge of his own as a Scandinavian, as a Norwegian, with the Inuit. And if the Inuit I met in Joyhaven, still today, I mean, they don't, they haven't studied history and they don't have doctorates and they haven't written books about it, but if they still collectively have good memories of Amundsen, even a century and more later, it speaks well for what happened at that time. And I wanted to, I mean, in my family, my grandfather was saved by an Aboriginal shaman, and the memories are very recent. And I wanted to pay tribute to the sharing of knowledge and the understanding across so-called cultural barriers in a way that does not exploit people. I hope Mira will find that I've answered her question. When I gave a lecture a few years ago at Cambridge University, there was a young woman who was actually in the single, we say Inuk for a person and Inuit for the people. It was an Inuk woman, and she said that she was the first person from the Inuit nation to do a doctorate. She was doing it. And she said to me, well, was Amundsen just passing through like so many people have passed through, anthropologists, priests, Mounties, missionaries, and sociologists, and I don't know, child protection workers and government bureaucrats? Or was he someone who was really interested and committed? So I said, I think if life had been more favorable to him, he would have returned and lived longer. So that's a rather long-winded answer to the question.
Very nice. Very. Thor was asking if you were able to find any artifacts left behind by Amundsen's trips. If there's any remains of his physical.
Well, I'll tell you, it's funny. If Thor is from Norway, he will know that the Maud was actually brought up from the bay in Cambridge Bay and hauled back. It was kind of an epic enterprise to the Oslo fjord, to a town whose name escapes me at the moment. And I'm not sure what they're going to do with it there, but they have the remains of it. In the very early phase of research for the film, I saw an artifact of Amundsen's explorations. Although he didn't sail the Maud to northern Canada, it was actually, he went bankrupt. It was seized in Seattle, and it was sold on auction to the Hudson's Bay Company. So indirectly, I confess, I took a long iron nail out of the Maud wreck, and I kept it. It's actually on the shelf behind me. So there is an artifact. I probably shouldn't have done that. But that was before the museum in Norway laid claims to it. They bought the wreck for $1, actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And then Thor was also wondering about the reactions and the feelings of the new kingdom of Norway, since it just became a country in 1905, or an independent country in 1905, about learning of Amundsen's accomplishments.
Well, this is a very interesting question, because when Amundsen left Norway on the Gjøa, as we say in English, the Joe, I mean, Norway was still with the Kingdom of Sweden. It was sort of a dual kingdom, and King Oscar was still the king of Norway. And I think he'd actually been a sponsor or patron in some capacity for the expedition. And by the time that Amundsen got through the Northwest Passage to northern Yukon in 1905, well, the situation had changed. And I'm sure that he was very happy about the change, that Norway had become an independent country, that they'd managed to do this in a very peaceful way, although they, showed a certain amount of willingness to defend their right to their sovereignty. I think that Amundsen and Nansen both came, and Nansen was very much involved in Norwegian independence. They both came at the very beginning of the new Norway. And of course, the new Norway is not a totally new country, because Norway has a very ancient history, going back to Heimskringla, the history of the kings of Norway. I mean, it goes back a very, very long time. And so it was like a return of national values that had been sort of subliminated for many years.
I also want to ask you about the book that you are making on the film, or can you just tell us more about the book?
I can. The first thing is I tend to do things backwards. So most people would write a book and then they would sell the rights and a film would be made from the book. But I realized I've written a few books before, including one biography that was very popular in Canada of a major well-known figure in this country. And I realized that getting out of the armchair and going into the wilderness and seeing with the camera eye changed my perspective totally. I strapped on my skis. The snow was very hard. I wasn't used to that. I would go dog sledding. I would spend time in the kitchen talking to Inuit and talking off camera as much as on camera. So I learned how to do research in a completely different way. And I made sure that I got as many oral traditions from different families as possible, European as well as Aboriginal, Chukchi and Inuit. So the book I'm working on, it's going to be a fairly major enterprise. It's coming in a few months. I would never have thought that, having finished the film on July 1st this year, already by mid-September, I would have won 3 major awards in film festivals. It is, after all, my first film. I won the award that I cherish the most is the award for Best Documentary Feature of the Year at the Toronto Independent Film Festival. I've submitted the film to a number of other festivals, and there are prospects of screenings in Norway, and in United States and in Canada as we speak, in Great Britain as well. There's growing interest in the film. So, but the writing a book is a different proposition altogether. And I would want to be very sure not to write a kind of a spin-off book or a derivative book that is basically rehashing what other biographers have written. A well-known biographer in Norway is Tor Borman Larsen, and I don't really see things the same way he does. And in Great Britain, a very well-known biographer is Roland Huntford, who wrote a dual biography of Amundsen and Scott. He also wrote a biography of Shackleton. He also wrote a biography of Scott, of Nansen, rather. So I want to do something that is really original. I do have an advantage that I have a lot of wonderful illustrations, because I was also taking still photos when I was making the film. So it will be an illustrated biography, but I want it to be based sort of on a kind of eyewitness perspective, that I didn't write it in an armchair in a university library, but I really got out there and exposed myself to howling winds and all the rest of it.
Can you talk a little bit more about the Chukchi and their current situation now in the Russian Federation? I'm just a little bit ignorant. I don't know much about sort of indigenous rights in that country. We know a little. We know about the Sami here. We know about the First Nations in Canada a little bit more. I was just sort of curious what that situation in Russia is right now for them.
I'm not very knowledgeable about that particular subject. I have met people from the Herzen Institute in St. Petersburg who've told me that national languages, for example, national indigenous languages, are very important in Russia and have been given a certain amount of attention. And of course, to continue speaking these languages is critical, and to have written texts in their languages, and to have computer software appropriate for the languages. But also, Chukotka, the region of northeastern Siberia, has gone through tremendous changes between camps of the Gulag during the years of late years of Lenin and the early and throughout the life of Stalin, and even thereafter, uranium mines. The Chukchi have traditionally been divided into two groups. One is the maritime Chukchi, who live by the sea and do hunting of right whales and belugas and seals and so forth. And then there are the reindeer Chukchi, who live in the interior and have domesticated reindeer and who have herds. They tend to herds. But as to where they are right at the moment, I couldn't tell you. I'm sorry.
Okay, I was just curious. Is there
I
any?
tried to figure out how to get there, and it would have been very complicated. I might have been able to get there, but then I might not have been able to get back. So
I remember we had a Greenlandic program about 6 years ago, and I believe you know the film, and I'm blanking on the film right now. It was the French guy who directed it. Uh, well, anyway, the lead actor in that film is also a bit of an explorer himself, and I remember he said he visited that region, and he said it was impossible to get there. There was no paved roads or very few paved roads, and it just took him forever. So
well, I'll tell you, even in Canada, to get to Johaven for me was very difficult because I had to. If you look at the map of Canada, I'm in Montreal, which is like 1/3 of the way over from the Atlantic towards the Pacific, and I would have to fly to Edmonton and then fly to Yellowknife.
Okay.
And then I would have to fly from there to Cambridge Bay. And then from there, if I was lucky, I would fly to Johavens, which is on an island even further north. And sometimes the weather was just too bad and I would have to wait. I would have to wait maybe a week in order to get there. And I'm sorry to say that some of the finest people that I got to know while making the film, one researcher on the icebreaker, and the person in the Canadian government who even got me onto the icebreaker in the first place, both died in plane crashes while I was shooting the film.
Oh man!
And I mean, it is dangerous sometimes to be traveling in the Arctic because the weather can be so fierce, and there can be equipment failures, whether because of extreme cold or a lack of instruments. I don't really know, but.
Well, I think that's all the questions that I have. Just quick looking through my notes if there's anything. Oh, one question that I always like to ask is, did your film change at all during the process of filming? Did you have sort of an idea at the beginning where, and all of a sudden it's sort of like, no, I'm going to go this way?
It happened many times.
Okay.
And this is my first film, so a part of my challenge was to make what I would consider to be a complete film.
Right.
And I got into I got into a panic last year being 2019. This is like you're doing a doctorate, you think you know everything about a given subject,
right?
And then you realize you know absolutely nothing, and you know even less than nothing, and the jury is going to laugh at you and kick you out when you present your dissertation. It's something like that.
Right.
I sometimes think that doing a doctorate is like you're making a huge pot of spaghetti for like 30 people and they're all really hungry. But then someone really nasty and devilish comes and takes your pot and flips it over and pours all the spaghetti onto the floor. And then your job is to take all the strands and piece them together. The story that I tell in the film is really, it's actually quite a complex story because you have the oral traditions, you have the psychological and physical health aspects, nutrition, you have the factual matter of what really happened and what was important. But last year I got into a panic and I was really unsure whether I would ever be able to finish the film. And then suddenly I had a dream. And one of my cinema gods Alfred Hitchcock. I'm not going to say he was a great person in his private life. I have no idea. But I admire Hitchcock a lot, even to this day. He came to me in my dream and he said to me, George, you're having a very hard time finishing your film. Why don't you let me take over and co-direct with you? And I said, well, listen, I really appreciate it, but I mean, how did you know about this? And he said, well, no. And during the course of the dream, I don't know, dreams sometimes last a few minutes or seconds, but he told me exactly how to make the film and how to finish it.
Wow.
And you can be sure that when I woke up, I took notes like crazy. And that's the film that I've made.
Wow.
I made it exactly according to specifications. So that's why there are dream scenes in the film. There are some scenes of psychosis and paranoia, because that's what it was like to be a polar explorer. It was like you were risking your life at every moment, and chances were you would not get home again.
Wow. Thor wants to know if the National Geographic Society has supported the film in any way, or where I guess where did the funding come from, if at any came from?
Well, I living in Canada, I thought that it would be a good idea to go to Canadian funding agencies, and I can say very simply that every single agency told me to get lost. They didn't really like the idea of the film, which was to show in a positive way, not an angry way, but in a positive way, what it means to be a non-racist person and to develop friendships across cultural barriers. They thought the subject was too foreign, too Norwegian, whereas, I mean, the greatest years of Amundsen's life were lived in Canada. I mean, that's interesting. And he learned things that he carried with him through his life. So I ended up funding it myself. And I'm not a wealthy person, so I actually melted down all the pots and pans in the kitchen to do that and sold it as scrap metal. So I'm now in the revenue making mode, which is a different mode, and I would like to recover my investment, but I received no funding support from any organization of any kind whatsoever. I showed a copy earlier on to the National Geographic Society, and they thought it was very interesting, but I mean, they have other priorities. So.
Well, on that point, that's a very good point, is that we are, not, the ticket price is also going to George as well. So it isn't just all going into the Scandinavia House pot. So we are splitting the ticket price. So it does help support both Scandinavia House in these difficult times, but also it does support George and recouping some of his funds as well. So I do encourage everyone to buy a ticket and watch the film. It's an excellent film. And tell your friends about it. As I said, we have extended the theatrical run until November 5th. So, and we will also accompany this talk that we had. It'll be on our YouTube page, and as well as our Scandinavia House page. So yeah, so I would like to thank you so much, George. This was a wonderful conversation, and thank you so much for your film. I learned a lot. I really appreciated seeing the film. Yeah, so thank you.
I'd like to thank you as well, Kyle. Thank you for inviting me. This is actually technically, even though it's a virtual event, it is the premiere of the film in New York City. So, and I appreciate the questions from Thor and from Mira. Perhaps there have been others who've asked questions and taking the time to see the film. And I hope that you've all really enjoyed it.
Yes. Thank you. And please do visit us. Well, George, you can always visit us again when the film or the book comes out, but also the audience members to visit us again. Okay.
Very well. Thank you.
Bye.